Right now, 6 different disasters are hitting the United States at exactly the same time. That's never happened before in American history, but it has happened before in world history. And every single time, it destroyed the superpower completely. Rome had 5 systems collapse simultaneously in its final century. Britain lost reserve currency status when 4 critical systems failed in the 1970s. The Soviet Union dissolved when 6 systems broke down together in under 3 years. And here's what should terrify you. Financial historians have a name for this pattern. They call it an Omni-Crisis. 6 interconnected breakdowns that create a feedback loop, making recovery mathematically impossible under current monetary systems. The debt spiral now costs over $1 trillion per year just in interest. The demographic cliff as 74 million baby boomers retire. Infrastructure decay as critical systems built in the 1930s reach end of life. Energy reserves deliberately drained for political theatre. Social division that prevents any unified response. And the global pivot away from dollar dominance that ends our ability to export inflation. Each crisis accelerates the others, and we have already passed the point where traditional policy solutions can work. Subscribe if you want to understand how these 6 systems connect and why we have less than 24 months before this becomes irreversible. While mainstream economists debate whether America faces recession or soft landing, they fundamentally misunderstand the nature of what approaches. The United States is not experiencing a typical economic downturn that can be resolved through interest rate adjustments or fiscal stimulus. Instead, America has entered what financial historians recognize as an omni-crisis, a coordinated breakdown of 6 critical systems occurring simultaneously and creating feedback loops that render traditional monetary policy mathematically ineffective. This phenomenon represents something far more systematic and deliberate than cyclical economic fluctuation. The Roman Empire provides the clearest historical parallel to America's current trajectory. During Rome's final century, 5 interconnected systems collapsed in sequence, each failure accelerating the others until recovery became impossible under existing monetary frameworks. The debasement of currency through silver content reduction from 90% to 5% between 200 and 270 AD created inflation that destroyed savings while funding military expenses. Simultaneously, infrastructure decay reduced trade efficiency, demographic shifts as Germanic tribes displaced Roman citizens altered tax collection. Social fractures between patricians and plebeians prevented unified responses, and barbarian invasions exploited military weakness caused by fiscal constraints. Each crisis fed the others in an accelerating spiral that no amount of military conquest or administrative reform could reverse. Britain experienced a similar pattern during the 1960s and 70s, when 4 critical systems failed simultaneously and cost the empire its reserve currency status. The pound sterling had dominated global trade for over 2 centuries, but demographic pressures from World War losses, combined with colonial independence movements that reduced resource extraction, while infrastructure investments in rebuilding consumed government revenues and social unrest over rationing and economic decline, prevented coordinated policy responses. By 1971, when Nixon ended dollar convertibility to gold, Britain had already lost its monetary dominance through this multi-system breakdown that made the pound unsuitable as a global reserve currency. The deliberate design of modern fiat monetary systems creates these inevitable collapse patterns through wealth concentration mechanisms built into fractional reserve banking and central bank debt monetization. Since 1971, when the last connection to gold was severed, every major economy operates on pure fiat currency, backed only by government taxation power and global acceptance. This system requires constant economic growth to service exponentially increasing debt burdens, while simultaneously concentrating wealth upward through interest payments to bondholders and banking institutions. The mathematical impossibility becomes apparent when debt service costs exceed the economy's ability to generate real wealth through productive activity. What appears as separate crises affecting different sectors of American society are actually interconnected components of a single systematic breakdown. The debt spiral, consuming over $1 trillion annually in interest payments, prevents infrastructure investment needed for economic productivity. Demographic shifts as baby boomers retire reduce the tax base while increasing healthcare and social security obligations. Infrastructure decay reduces economic efficiency and increases maintenance costs. Energy vulnerability creates supply chain disruptions and inflation pressure. Social division prevents coordinated policy responses to any of these challenges. The global pivot away from dollar dominance removes the ability to export inflation through money printing. Each system failure accelerates the others, creating what mathematicians recognize as a positive feedback loop, where traditional economic tools become counterproductive. The timeline shows these 6 systems reaching critical failure points simultaneously between 2024 and 2026. Representing the mathematical culmination of 50 years of monetary engineering designed to extract wealth from productive populations while concentrating financial control among banking institutions. The United States federal government now allocates over $1 trillion annually solely to service interest payments on existing debt, a figure that exceeds the entire military budget and represents more than the gross domestic product of most developed nations. This unprecedented burden reflects not temporary fiscal mismanagement, but the mathematical inevitability built into the Federal Reserve monetary system established in 1913. The architects of central banking designed compound interest mechanics that ensure exponential debt growth while constraining economic output to linear expansion, creating an inescapable mathematical trap that transfers wealth from productive populations to financial institutions through government borrowing mechanisms. The fundamental structure of sovereign debt under fiat currency systems creates exponential growth curves that no amount of economic productivity can sustain indefinitely. When governments borrow money that central banks create from nothing, they commit taxpayers to pay compound interest on principal that never existed as real wealth. Economic output, constrained by physical resources and human productivity, can only grow linearly or arithmetically, while debt obligations expand exponentially through compounding mechanisms. This mathematical divergence becomes apparent over decades as debt service consumes ever larger portions of government revenue until the system reaches mathematical impossibility. The Nixon shock of 1971 represents the pivotal moment when deliberate policy decisions removed all constraints on debt creation by severing the dollar's connection to gold reserves. Prior to 1971, the Bretton Woods system theoretically limited government borrowing through gold convertibility requirements, though even this system had been systematically undermined since 1913. Once Nixon closed the gold window, claiming temporary necessity during Vietnam War financing pressures, the Federal Reserve gained unlimited ability to monetize government debt without any backing beyond taxation power and global acceptance. This policy shift enabled 5 decades of exponential debt accumulation that would have been impossible under any commodity-backed monetary standard. Modern monetary theory serves as intellectual cover for the wealth transfer mechanisms embedded in fiat debt creation, obscuring the reality that government borrowing represents systematic extraction from taxpayers to benefit bondholders. When central banks purchase government securities, they create new currency units that dilute the purchasing power of existing money held by citizens while providing interest-bearing assets to financial institutions. The interest payments flow continuously from taxpayers through government collection to bond holders, primarily foreign central banks, domestic financial institutions, and wealthy individuals who can afford to hold government securities. This mechanism concentrates wealth upward while creating the illusion that government spending provides economic benefits to the general population. The debt-to-GDP ratio has crossed critical thresholds identified by Harvard economists Carmen Reinhart and Kenneth Rogoff, whose historical analysis of sovereign debt crises across 8 centuries demonstrates that when debt service exceeds 40% of government revenue, default becomes mathematically inevitable. Rising interest rates create a death spiral where governments must issue new debt solely to pay interest on existing obligations, accelerating the exponential growth curve until debt service consumes all available revenue. Historical precedents from Latin American debt crises of the 1980s and European sovereign debt problems of the 2010s show this pattern repeating when governments lose the ability to roll over maturing debt at sustainable interest rates. The current trajectory prevents infrastructure investment, social programs, and economic stimulus because debt service obligations consume resources that could otherwise support productive economic activity. This creates the first feedback loop in the Omni-Crisis pattern, where fiscal constraints caused by exponential debt growth reduce the government's ability to maintain the physical and social infrastructure necessary for economic growth, further reducing the tax base needed to service existing debt obligations and accelerating the mathematical impossibility of the current monetary framework. The largest generation in American history, 74 million baby boomers, now exits the workforce at a rate of 10,000 individuals per day, fundamentally destroying the mathematical foundation upon which Social Security and Medicare were constructed in the 1930s and 1960s. This demographic transition represents far more than natural generational change, because the architects of these systems deliberately designed them as demographic Ponzi schemes, requiring constant population growth and wage increases to remain mathematically viable. The worker-to-beneficiary ratio that sustained these programs for decades has collapsed from 16 workers supporting each retiree in 1950 to just 2.8 workers today, with projections showing a catastrophic decline to 2 workers per beneficiary by 2035. Social Security operates on pay-as-you-go mechanics, where current workers fund current retirees rather than building individual accounts, creating the classic Ponzi structure that requires exponential growth in the contributor base to remain solvent. When Franklin Roosevelt signed Social Security into law in 1935, life expectancy was 61 years, while the retirement age was set at 65, ensuring most contributors would die before collecting benefits. The few survivors would be supported by a massive base of younger workers in a rapidly expanding economy. This mathematical relationship worked for decades because post-war population growth and industrial expansion provided the exponential increase in contributors necessary to fund a smaller retiree population. However, demographic mathematics have inverted as baby boomers live longer while having fewer children, creating the inevitable collapse that actuaries predicted decades ago, but politicians refused to address. Medicare faces even more severe mathematical constraints because healthcare costs have grown exponentially faster than wages or economic output for 50 years. While Social Security faces a straightforward ratio problem between workers and beneficiaries, Medicare confronts the compound challenge of more beneficiaries consuming healthcare services that increase in cost far beyond inflation rates. The average Medicare beneficiary now consumes approximately $300,000 in lifetime benefits, while contributing roughly $100,000 during their working years, creating a mathematical gap that requires massive subsidies from general tax revenue beyond payroll contributions. The Social Security Trust Fund represents one of the most sophisticated accounting illusions in government finance, containing no actual assets beyond Treasury securities that constitute IOUs from the same government, already $38 trillion in debt. When payroll taxes exceeded benefit payments during previous decades, the surplus was immediately spent on general government operations, while the trust fund received non-marketable Treasury bonds. These securities represent promises by a bankrupt government to pay future obligations using money that does not exist, backed by the same taxation power already committed to servicing exponentially growing debt obligations. The 2033 insolvency date represents the mathematical moment when incoming payroll taxes can fund only 77% of promised benefits, forcing immediate tax increases or benefit reductions during peak boomer retirement when political resistance will be maximum. This demographic shift creates profound economic drag effects that accelerate the other components of the Omni-Crisis through reduced productivity as experienced workers retire, increased healthcare spending that diverts resources from productive investment, and deflationary pressure as retirees shift from consumption to wealth preservation strategies. Retired populations consume fewer goods and services while demanding more government transfers, reducing the economic growth needed to service debt obligations while simultaneously increasing government spending requirements. The mathematical impossibility becomes apparent when declining worker productivity must support both exponentially growing debt service and exponentially growing retiree obligations through the same constrained tax base, creating the second feedback loop that makes traditional policy solutions counterproductive and ensuring that demographic mathematics will force systematic breakdown of the current monetary framework. The American Society of Civil Engineers assigns United States infrastructure an overall grade of C-, but this assessment dramatically understates the systemic vulnerability created when critical systems constructed during the 1930s through 1960s simultaneously reach end of life while facing unprecedented cyber warfare threats that make even newer systems vulnerable to coordinated attack. The mathematical impossibility emerges because infrastructure replacement requires massive capital investment during the debt crisis, when government resources are already committed to exponentially growing interest obligations, while delaying necessary repairs increases eventual costs exponentially through cascade failures that damage interconnected systems. The electrical grid represents the most critical vulnerability because American power distribution operates through three separate regional systems designed for 20th century demand patterns and built before computer integration created cyber attack vectors. The Texas freeze of February 2021 demonstrated how deregulated markets prioritize short-term profit maximization over system redundancy, leaving millions without power when winter storms stressed generating capacity beyond design limits. California's rolling blackouts reveal similar vulnerabilities where decades of deferred maintenance and environmental regulations prevented infrastructure expansion needed to meet growing demand, while wildfire risks force preemptive shutdowns that cascade through economic systems dependent on reliable power supply. Grid failure creates immediate cascade effects that cripple water treatment facilities dependent on electric pumps, communication networks requiring constant power input, banking systems that cannot process transactions without electricity, and fuel distribution networks that rely on electric pumps at every stage, from refineries to gas stations. The interdependence means single-point failures can trigger regional economic collapse within hours, while restoration requires coordinated repair efforts across multiple damaged systems simultaneously. Cyber warfare capabilities demonstrated by foreign adversaries through attacks on colonial pipeline and municipal water systems prove that physical infrastructure vulnerabilities are compounded by digital attack vectors that can disable systems remotely without requiring physical presence or military invasion. Municipal water systems face dual mathematical impossibilities through aging pipe networks that lose 6 billion gallons daily through leaks, while requiring $400 billion in lead pipe replacement costs that exceed most municipal budgets by orders of magnitude. The Flint, Michigan crisis represents a preview of nationwide water system failures when financially constrained municipalities attempt cost-cutting measures that compromise public health, while cyber attacks on treatment facilities demonstrate how foreign adversaries can poison water supplies through computer infiltration of control systems. Water infrastructure, built in the early 20th century, operates beyond design life while serving populations double or triple original projections, creating systematic failure points that multiply exponentially as pipe networks age beyond replacement schedules. The investment trap becomes mathematically inescapable because infrastructure repair costs increase exponentially when maintenance is deferred, while government debt obligations prevent the massive capital spending required for systematic replacement. Public-private partnerships, marketed as solutions, actually transfer infrastructure ownership to financial institutions that extract permanent revenue streams from essential services while minimizing maintenance spending to maximize profit margins. These arrangements convert public infrastructure into rent extraction mechanisms that increase costs for users, while reducing system reliability and creating permanent interest payments to private capital. Infrastructure decay feeds directly into the debt spiral by reducing economic productivity through transportation bottlenecks, communication failures, and energy disruptions, while simultaneously increasing government spending requirements for emergency repairs and public health responses to system failures. The demographic crisis accelerates infrastructure breakdown because retiring workers possess institutional knowledge about aging systems, while younger workers lack experience with maintenance procedures developed over decades. Energy vulnerability compounds infrastructure problems because repair operations require reliable fuel supplies, while social division prevents coordinated investment in systematic replacement programs, creating the third feedback loop that ensures infrastructure collapse will accelerate all other components of the Omni-Crisis, while preventing traditional policy responses that require functional systems to implement effectively. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, constructed after the 1973 oil embargo, specifically to provide 90 days of emergency energy security during supply disruptions, has been systematically drained to levels not witnessed since the 1980s through deliberate political decisions that prioritized short-term gasoline price reduction over national security preparedness. This depletion represents a calculated sacrifice of America's primary energy defense mechanism for temporary electoral advantage, eliminating the buffer that protected the economy during previous Middle Eastern conflicts, and leaving the nation defenseless against coordinated supply manipulation by hostile energy exporting cartels. The Biden administration's release of 180 million barrels from Strategic Petroleum Reserve during 2022 reduced emergency stockpiles from 695 million barrels to 340. 7 million barrels, cutting America's energy security buffer by exactly 50% in 18 months. This unprecedented depletion occurred not during wartime emergency or natural disaster, but purely to lower gasoline prices before midterm elections, converting strategic national security assets into short-term political capital. The mathematical reality demonstrates that current reserve levels provide less than 30 days of import replacement during supply disruption, far below the 90-day minimum established by energy security experts after analyzing previous oil shock impacts on economic stability. American domestic oil production, despite recent increases through fracking technology, still requires between 6 and 8 million barrels per day in foreign imports to meet consumption demands that exceed domestic extraction capacity. This import dependence means that regardless of domestic production levels, the United States remains vulnerable to global supply manipulation through coordinated action by energy exporting nations that control the marginal barrels necessary to meet American demand. The mathematical vulnerability becomes apparent when considering that even small percentage reductions in global supply create exponential price increases due to inelastic demand curves, while domestic production cannot be rapidly scaled to compensate for import disruptions. OPEC plus coordination between traditional Middle Eastern producers, Russia, and increasingly China, creates unprecedented leverage over American energy prices through supply management that can trigger recession regardless of domestic production capabilities. Russian energy exports provide Moscow with economic warfare capabilities demonstrated through European natural gas supply manipulation, while Chinese control over refining capacity and rare earth minerals needed for energy infrastructure gives Beijing additional pressure points beyond direct oil supply control. The coordination between these three power centers creates the potential for synchronized energy pressure that could crash the American economy through deliberate supply restrictions designed to trigger financial crisis during debt vulnerability. Previous oil shocks in 1973 and 1979 triggered severe recessions when American debt levels and infrastructure vulnerability were orders of magnitude lower than current conditions. The 1973 embargo quadrupled oil prices and caused GDP contraction exceeding 6%, while the 1979 Iranian Revolution doubled energy costs and created stagflation that required Federal Reserve interest rates exceeding 20% to control. Current debt to GDP ratios and infrastructure dependency make similar energy price shocks catastrophically more damaging because the economy cannot withstand the monetary policy responses that resolved previous crises. Energy vulnerability creates the fourth feedback loop. In the Omni-Crisis, by making all economic activity more expensive through transportation and production costs, while simultaneously reducing government revenue through recession-induced tax collection decline. Infrastructure systems depend on reliable energy supplies for maintenance operations, while demographic pressures increase healthcare and social service energy consumption. Social division prevents coordinated energy independence policies, while international adversaries exploit American energy dependence to accelerate debt crisis through economically targeted supply manipulation, ensuring that energy vulnerability amplifies every other systemic failure while eliminating policy tools previously available during less vulnerable periods. America faces its deepest political polarization since the Civil War, with 40% of both Republican and Democratic voters viewing the opposing party as an existential threat to the nation's survival rather than legitimate political opposition. This unprecedented division does not represent organic disagreement over policy preferences, but constitutes the predictable result of deliberate information fragmentation combined with financial stress, designed to prevent unified responses to systematic economic manipulation. The mathematical precision of this division reveals itself through polling data showing nearly identical percentages of mutual hostility across party lines, suggesting coordinated psychological operations rather than natural political evolution. Economic inequality creates tribal political responses, where each faction blames opposing groups rather than examining the monetary system design that extracts wealth from all productive populations, regardless of political affiliation. When middle-class purchasing power declines through monetary debasement and debt service obligations, human psychology defaults to zero-sum thinking, where other groups must be gaining advantage through unfair means. This tribal response prevents examination of Federal Reserve policies, banking system structure, and debt monetization mechanisms that systematically transfer wealth upward while creating the economic stress that fuels political antagonism between artificially divided populations. Social media algorithms amplify division for profit by promoting content that generates engagement through outrage and emotional response, creating information ecosystems where opposing groups consume completely different versions of reality. Technology corporations discovered that anger and fear create higher user engagement than cooperation and rational discourse, leading to algorithmic promotion of divisive content that maximizes advertising revenue while fragmenting shared factual understanding necessary for democratic governance. The business model requires constant escalation of emotional intensity to maintain user attention, inevitably leading to extremist content that makes political compromise mathematically impossible. Financial institutions fund both sides of political conflicts through campaign contributions, lobbying expenditures, and think tank support to ensure policy paralysis that prevents meaningful reform of monetary and banking systems. Wall Street banks, private equity firms, and insurance companies provide nearly identical funding levels to Republican and Democratic candidates, purchasing influence that guarantees neither party will challenge the fundamental structure of debt-based currency creation or fractional reserve banking. This bipartisan capture ensures that political theatre continues while actual economic policy remains controlled by the same financial interests, regardless of election outcomes. Congressional approval ratings, consistently below 20%, reflect systematic inability to pass infrastructure spending, entitlement reform, or debt reduction measures because each party's base opposes solutions proposed by the opposition, regardless of technical merit. The mathematical impossibility becomes apparent when infrastructure repair requires bipartisan cooperation, while social division makes such cooperation politically suicidal for representatives who depend on increasingly polarized primary voters for re-election. Governance breakdown accelerates as political incentives reward extremist positions that prevent compromise necessary for addressing systematic crises. The national divorce movement reflects growing sentiment for political separation, with polling showing over 40% support for regional autonomy arrangements that would allow different areas to implement separate governance systems. This sentiment parallels historical examples where fiscal crises preceded national breakups when central governments lost legitimacy through economic failure. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991 when economic collapse eliminated the central authority's ability to provide services or maintain order. Yugoslavia fractured during the 1990s as hyperinflation destroyed the common currency and created ethnic conflict over diminishing resources. Social division creates the fifth feedback loop by preventing coordinated policy responses to debt crisis, infrastructure decay, demographic pressures, and energy vulnerability, while international adversaries exploit American political paralysis to accelerate systemic breakdown through information warfare that amplifies existing divisions and ensures that no unified response to the Omni-Crisis becomes politically feasible under current democratic structures. The foundation of American economic hegemony rests upon the petrodollar system established in 1974, which requires global oil purchases to be conducted exclusively in United States dollars, creating artificial worldwide demand for American currency that enables deficit spending without immediate inflation consequences. This arrangement, formalized through agreements with Saudi Arabia following the 1973 oil embargo, allowed America to export inflation globally while importing goods through money printing that other nations were forced to accept as payment for essential energy resources. The systematic dismantling of this privileged position by BRICS nations represents the end of what French Finance Minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing termed America's exorbitant privilege in 1965. Saudi Arabia's decision not to renew the 50-year petrodollar agreement represents a calculated geopolitical shift that opens global oil trade to Chinese yuan, Russian rubles, Indian rupees, and other currencies for the first time since the mid-1970s. This seemingly technical change in payment mechanisms eliminates the forced global demand for dollars that enabled unlimited money printing without domestic inflation consequences, because foreign nations required dollar reserves to purchase energy regardless of their trade relationships with America. The mathematical impact becomes apparent when considering that global oil trade exceeds $4 trillion annually, representing artificial dollar demand that allowed the Federal Reserve to create currency without the immediate price increases that would occur in a closed domestic system. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, expanded to include over 40 additional nations, have constructed parallel financial infrastructure designed to bypass dollar dominance through alternative payment systems, development banks, and trade agreements that eliminate American currency from international transactions. The BRICS payment system processes trade settlements in local currencies, while the new development bank provides project financing without dollar denomination, creating functional alternatives to SWIFT banking networks and International Monetary Fund lending facilities. China's Belt and Road Initiative extends this parallel system across Asia, Africa, and South America through infrastructure investments that establish yuan-denominated trade relationships independent of American financial control. The historical precedent demonstrates identical patterns when British pound sterling lost reserve currency status during the 1940s and 50s, as American economic dominance replaced British imperial trade networks. Britain maintained global currency status for over 2 centuries through colonial resource extraction and naval power that enforced sterling-denominated trade, but demographic losses from 2 world wars, colonial independence movements, and American economic competition eliminated the artificial demand that supported pound dominance. The transition occurred gradually as trading partners adopted dollar alternatives, then accelerated rapidly when the mathematical advantages of reserve currency status reversed into systemic disadvantages during economic stress periods. Reduced global dollar demand forces inflation back to America while ending the IJ's ability to finance government debt through money printing without immediate domestic price consequences. When foreign nations no longer require dollar reserves for essential trade, Federal Reserve money creation cannot be exported through international transactions and instead circulates domestically, driving consumer price increases that previous reserve currency status had deflected to global markets. This creates the inflation trap, where traditional monetary policy tools become counterproductive because interest rate increases to control inflation simultaneously accelerate the debt spiral by increasing government borrowing costs. The geopolitical pivot creates the final feedback loop in the Omni-Crisis by eliminating policy flexibility needed to address debt obligations, infrastructure spending, demographic pressures, energy vulnerability, and social division through monetary expansion. International isolation accelerates as trading partners adopt alternative currencies, while domestic inflation prevents the stimulus spending that previous administrations used during economic crises, ensuring that traditional policy responses become mathematically impossible, precisely when systematic breakdown requires unprecedented government intervention to prevent complete economic collapse under the current monetary framework. The mathematical convergence of all 6 crisis systems reaches critical mass simultaneously within the 2024 to 2026 timeframe, creating an unprecedented situation where debt service will consume over 50% of federal tax revenue, while Social Security insolvency forces immediate benefit reductions. Infrastructure failures accelerate exponentially. Energy reserves provide less than 30 days of import replacement. Political division prevents any coordinated response, and international dollar rejection eliminates the policy flexibility that previous administrations relied upon during economic emergencies. This convergence represents not coincidental timing, but the inevitable mathematical conclusion of interconnected systems designed to concentrate wealth upward while creating unsustainable obligations for the host population. Each crisis prevents solutions to all others through feedback loop acceleration that makes traditional policy tools counterproductive precisely when systematic intervention becomes most necessary. Debt obligations prevent infrastructure investment needed for economic productivity, while infrastructure decay reduces the economic growth required to service debt burdens. Demographic pressures increase government spending while reducing tax-based productivity, simultaneously accelerating debt accumulation and infrastructure maintenance requirements. Energy vulnerability increases all economic costs, while political division prevents the coordinated policy responses needed to address any individual crisis component. International dollar rejection eliminates the monetary expansion capability needed to finance emergency spending, while domestic inflation prevents the stimulus measures that previous generations of policymakers used during crisis periods. Historical pattern analysis reveals identical trajectories in the final collapse phases of previous hegemonies, where multiple system failures created self-reinforcing breakdown cycles that rendered traditional governance ineffective. The Roman Empire experienced currency debasement, infrastructure decay, demographic displacement, military overextension, and barbarian pressure simultaneously during its final century, creating conditions where no amount of administrative reform or military conquest could restore systematic stability. The British Empire lost reserve currency status when colonial independence, demographic losses, infrastructure investment requirements, and American economic competition eliminated the artificial advantages that had sustained sterling dominance for over 2 centuries. The Soviet Union dissolved when central planning failures, demographic decline, ethnic tensions, military spending burdens, and international economic pressure converged during the 1980s to create mathematical impossibility of continued central authority. The standard of living adjustment facing average Americans represents systematic reduction in purchasing power, service availability, and economic security rather than apocalyptic collapse, as the financial system transitions toward post-dollar international order that eliminates the artificial prosperity enabled by reserve currency status since 1945. This transition means higher prices for imported goods, reduced government services, infrastructure degradation, and elimination of the consumption levels that characterized American middle-class life during the period of global monetary dominance. The adjustment represents restoration of historical norms rather than unprecedented catastrophe, because the post-World War II American prosperity constituted a temporary historical anomaly enabled by unique circumstances of global destruction that left America as the sole intact industrial economy with reserve currency privileges. The validation of audience intuition confirms that systematic manipulation was deliberately embedded in monetary system design from the Federal Reserve's 1913 establishment through the Bretton Woods arrangement and Nixon shock policy decisions that created the current debt-based currency framework. The mathematical impossibility was always intended to concentrate wealth among financial institutions while creating unsustainable obligations for productive populations. And the current Omni-Crisis represents the planned conclusion of over a century of financial engineering designed to extract maximum wealth from the American economy before systematic transition to alternative international monetary arrangements controlled by the same banking